All right, our next speaker is George Bisharat, and as I mentioned before, he's a trial lawyer, was a trial lawyer for the Office of Public Defender in San Francisco before joining the UC Law San Francisco faculty in 1991. Professor Bisharat studied law, anthropology, and Middle East studies at Harvard and wrote a book about Palestinian lawyers working under Israeli military occupation in the West Bank. This talk today will explore the question, is genocide back? Turn this over to Professor Bisharat.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for, again, working so hard to organize this conference. It's always a pleasure and an honor to participate in these. I learned so much from the other speakers, and I really think it's a vital effort, and I applaud you for keeping it going for now 6 years. So the question in my title, Is Genocide Back?, is prompted by the reality that we're now in the 1,035th day of Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people of Gaza that has killed more than 73,000 Palestinians directly, destroyed more than 90% of their housing, and has corralled them into a tiny space where tents provide no cover from Israel's relentless killing spree. Israeli attacks have killed, as of 2 days ago, 1,254 Palestinian men, women, and children since the so-called ceasefire of October 2025. Meaning, in other words, that the genocide has downshifted, but has never ended. Nor is there anything evident today that will challenge this dynamic. Genocide, live streamed to the world, has become normalized, a part of everyday life. Now, to be honest with you, I don't have a firm answer to my own question, is genocide back? What I have instead are 3 hypotheses that I want to review together with you. The stakes for this are high, for this audience specifically. If genocide's prohibition is ending, Indigenous peoples are the first in line to feel it. So I will preview the 3 hypotheses briefly, then go through each one in more detail and tell you which I find most persuasive. Though I want you to weigh them for yourselves, since I think there are real arguments for each. The first hypothesis is genocide is back, but only for Israel. The second hypothesis is genocide is back, but not just for Israel, rather generally. And then the third hypothesis is genocide is back, not as an isolated phenomenon, but rather as part of a wider breakdown of the post-war international legal order. A few words on the concept of genocide first. Genocide, the deed, was not new when genocide, the word, was coined. It had been the routine instrument of settler colonial projects for centuries across the Americas, Africa, Australia, and beyond. Populations displaced, starved, and killed deliberately to clear land and break indigenous resistance. None of that was called genocide at the time. There was no legal category for it. The category arrived only after the Nazi Holocaust, the first genocide in history committed against a European people. The Genocide Convention of 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the broader edifice of international humanitarian law built on top of them, all emerged from that specific catastrophe. And yet, the umbrella that got built was broader than its founding case, at least on paper. Genocide became the crime of all crimes, extending its protection, however imperfectly, to indigenous peoples worldwide. But I want to be precise about how limited that protection was designed to be from the start. The limiting wasn't an oversight, rather it was fought for deliberately. Polish jurist Raphael Lemkin's original convention draft included what he called cultural genocide, the the deliberate destruction of a group's language, religion, and institutions, I would say including their traditions of body tattooing, not just the killing of its members. In 1948, that provision was stripped out. It was actively opposed by the UK, France, Belgium, and by settler states, including the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Canada's delegation was instructed by Ottawa to be prepared to sink the entire convention rather than let cultural genocide survive in the text. There's a second limitation which is less visible because no one really fought over a clause for it. And that stems from how the Nazi Holocaust, or perhaps a specific understanding or even misunderstanding of it, became the unspoken paradigmatic example of the crime. And that, let's call it an image of the Nazi Holocaust, was as a pure expression of racial hatred. The historian Dirk Moses argues that genocide law rests on a false dichotomy between this pure ideological racial hatred and the ordinary security-driven violence, which somehow doesn't amount to genocidal intent. Yet, almost no historical mass violence, Moses argues, is actually one or the other. Even Nazi ideology framed Jews not just with hatred, but as an existential security threat to the German nation, a conspiratorial danger to the German people. So the Holocaust actually fits this security necessity logic too, but it is the racial hatred dimension of it that looms large in both popular and political imagination. And that means that self-defense against an existential threat isn't just a rhetorical trick invented for any one conflict. It's available in principle to any state prepared to use it. And it's worth keeping in mind because more than one hypothesis ahead may draw on that same ambiguity. So the question in front of us is whether Gaza marks the end of, or even the narrower protection that survived these limitations that I just described. So here are my three hypothetical answers to that question. So I told you, the first one is genocide is back, but only for Israel, which is really another way of saying that it isn't back generally at all. The argument? Israel occupies a unique position among the world's states. 78 years of American patronage, military aid, intelligence sharing, repeated Security Council vetoes, combined with deep institutional entanglement across European capitals, has built Israel a bespoke impunity, not a template available to any state. No other occupying power, no other active settler colonial project has this exact configuration of great power backing, legal cover, and command of the Western media narrative. This isn't abstract. It's visible in the record. When South Africa brought its case to the International Court of Justice in late 2023, the court found the genocide claim plausible enough to order provisional measures within weeks, and has ordered more since. So the World Court, at its highest urgency procedure, saying a real risk of genocide is underway. If the patronage hypothesis that I just made is right, this is exactly what you'd expect to see. A legal finding that would jeopardize almost any other state's relationship with Washington and with Western Europe, absorbed here without consequence. That's not just an alliance where politics happens to override law, the way many alliances work. It's Israel occupying an exceptional category, treated as though the ordinary framework, the one that at least nominally constrains other U.S. allies, doesn't reach it in the same way. It's as if Israel, the eternal victim of the Holocaust, always under threat of its repetition, has the privilege to engage in acts that, for any other nation, would be universally condemned. There may be a psychological mechanism underneath the political one, too. The global North's post-war moral vocabulary was built around Jews as history's paradigmatic genocide victims. That's functionally what never again has meant for 80 years. It simply doesn't compute in the global North's intellectual construct with the hatred component of genocidal intent front of mind that the victims of genocide could later become its perpetrators. It also renders them especially sympathetic, or perhaps empathetic, to claims that Israel is only acting out of existential self-defense, overlooking exactly the false dichotomy that Moses argued against, that racial hatred and existential fear are virtually always fused in the minds of perpetrators of genocide. So if this is right, this first hypothesis, genocide is back, is the wrong thing. For Palestinians under this architecture, it may be more accurate to say it never left, but also that it doesn't generalize. Singular crimes don't necessarily set precedent. That brings me to my second hypothesis. Genocide is back, and generally, it is not confined to one victim population, because tolerating it once, visibly, publicly, changes what every other state expects it can get away with. Legal norms depend on a claim of consistency to have legitimate force and to be applied consistently. The moment the crime of all crimes is committed in real time, documented, live streamed, adjudicated through ICJ measures, subject to ICC, International Criminal Court, that is, warrants, and the world's most powerful states respond with cover and complicity instead of enforcement, the cost drops for everyone watching, not just Israel. And other states are watching closely. One need only look at contemporary Sudan, where in October 2025, rapid support forces overran al-Fashid, killing some 6,000 members of the Fur, Masalit, and Zadarawa tribes within 3 days. The ultimate death toll by one unverified source was 60,000, and other crimes, including rape and torture, were also alleged. Per a UN fact-finding mission, this all amounted to genocide. Now, personally, I'm not sure that Sudan is, in fact, a new example of genocide spreading as a consequence of Gaza. It may only be a resumption of an earlier pattern in which genocides occurring between people of color in places outside of great power interest simply don't register, or at least don't register or don't trigger immediate intervention. It also pays to remember that the ICC, again, International Criminal Court, does have a record of arresting, prosecuting, and convicting African warlords. And that the situation in Sudan may not have fully played out. We may still see investigations and prosecutions coming out of that situation. But assuming for the moment the tolerance for genocide is indeed spreading beyond Israel, doesn't that mean that the whole post-war order is already coming apart? Doesn't hypothesis 2 blend into hypothesis 3? Not necessarily, and here's my evidence for it. Joe Biden, former President Joe Biden's own record with the ICC makes a fascinating test case. In 2021, his administration rescinded Trump's sanctions on International Criminal Court prosecutor Fatou Bensouda. 2 years later, when the court indicted Putin over the abduction of Ukrainian children, Biden called the warrant justified. He helped fund and staff the joint US-UK-EU effort that raised millions of dollars for the prosecution of Putin at a London conference. But when the court turned toward Netanyahu, the posture flipped. Biden called that application outrageous application for an arrest warrant. Arms transfers continued through the worst months of the genocide, and the U.S. vetoed ceasefire resolutions in the Security Council repeatedly, all from an administration that never stopped invoking the rules-based international order as its defining mantra. No sanctions on judges, no threats to annex an ally's territory, no abduction of a foreign head of state. General tolerance for genocide can run through an ordinary great power hypocrisy alone without the rest of the order coming down. At least that's how it appeared for a period of time. There is, of course, reason to believe that Biden's ICC hypocrisy had its own corrosive effect on the international legal order, and that it, in fact, paved the way for what followed. In other words, perhaps what I'm describing in Hypothesis 2 was, in fact, a stage leading to the next. Now, this is the third hypothesis, and what I will suggest to you is that what has happened since under President Trump is different in kind, not just degree, and this is actually the hypothesis that I find most persuasive of the three. Genocide is back, but not in isolation, as one piece of a general global act of the post-war legal order led by the United States on behalf of Israel, but also for itself. Start with the assault on the International Criminal Court itself. In November 2024, the ICC issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel and his former defense minister, Yoav Gallant, over the Gaza genocide. Within weeks of returning to office, Trump responded not with legal argument, but by declaring a national emergency over the court's existence and sanctioning its chief prosecutor and judge's directive. Marco Rubio has since escalated that into an open campaign, his words last month, to dismantle the ICC brick by brick. Sitting judges have been sanctioned for adjudicating a case. Three have sued the U.S. government over these sanctions. UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese has been sanctioned simply for cooperating with the court's investigation of Israel. There's an even starker example. In June 2025, of course, Israel and the United States struck Iran's nuclear facilities jointly. Israel first, then Trump authorizing U.S. bunker buster strikes. Neither government secured Security Council authorization, nor could point to any kind of imminent attack that self-defense actually requires. International law scholars across the spectrum have called it what the UN Charter calls aggression. Now, widen the frame still further. The abduction of Venezuela's head of state, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife, Silvia Flores, seized by U.S. Special Forces from Caracas in January, flown to New York in shackles, while American forces secured the country's oil. Open talk of annexing Greenland, threats against Panama and Canada, a revived Monroe or Don Road doctrine backed by force, asserting the U.S.'s right to dictate outcomes across an entire hemisphere. Murders of hundreds of people in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific without probable cause or any other legal pretext, including double tap strikes. And in Gaza itself, colonialism reasserting itself in new packaging in this preposterous board of peace imposed from outside with barely a nod to Palestinian sovereignty. None of this is happening in separate silos. It's the same posture applied everywhere. International law is an inconvenience to be dismantled, not argued with, whenever it constrains American or Israeli power. That doesn't make hypothesis 1 and 2 wrong. Sudan still reminds us that the older pattern hypothesis 2 describes predates all of this. But hypothesis 3 is the one that explains why this moment feels different, not just worse in degree. Here's what I do think is certain. Legal protection was never a reliable floor on its own. Political power and visibility have always done the real work, or its absence has. That's been Indigenous peoples' experience of international law since it existed. Gaza, Sudan, and Venezuela may not be telling us something new about the world. What they're doing is making it undeniable, because the states that wrote the rules have finally stopped pretending to follow them. Thanks. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. There should be lots of questions.
I've rendered you speechless.
Basically. Andy, yes.
A very powerful presentation, and I think that, and I agree with you on the third point, it's the most descriptive, but it is important that Israel is sort of the spearhead of this. And
Yes.
I would point out that their former Mossad director, Tamir Pardo, who was appointed by Netanyahu, and 600 Israeli security officials have written to President Trump about the situation in Gaza. And after a recent visit, Pardo said that what he saw made him ashamed to be a Jew. That is a very strong statement for a Jew to make,
Yes.
particularly one who had been appointed by Netanyahu. And I would just quickly reference that Netanyahu has basically turned Israel into a one-party state. And the Labor Party, which was very important in the formation of Israel, it has about 5% of the Knesset. So they're really not, there's no opposition, or there's very feeble opposition. And I think it's very important, if Israel is able to get away with this, and I speak, there's a difference between Israel, the state of Israel, and Jews. It's going to really shatter, as you say, the post-war consensus about human rights, which represents a step up in the history of humanity. So my question is, there have been people writing to the president and other bodies, but what has the UN done, or who has brought this before the UN to highlight the issue? What legal and other actions are being done to try to expose the genocide, get it defined as genocide, and then rebuild?
Sure. Well, thank you for your question. The most prominent example through the UN system is South Africa's case in the International Court of Justice, which of course is part of the UN system, charging Israel with genocide. And that case was launched in December of 2023, so very soon after the beginning of the genocide. And although, you know, the numbers of killings by that point had not reached anything like they have today, all of the elements of a genocide violation were evident already by that time. To its credit, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, which is composed of the most eminent judges from around the world, from all different legal systems, has treated this issue with a great deal of care. Unfortunately, with its typically slow, procedure. But as of January of 2024, it adopted its first provisional measures, which in a kind of an emergency situation, in the statute of the court, you can apply for intervention, before the case is fully adjudicated. And the court took the request from South Africa seriously and demanded that Israel halt a number of its activities and also to ensure the supply of humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip. These, of course, these requirements were ignored by Israel, and the action in the court was, condemned and reviled by, U.S. government officials and the like. But the court forged ahead. Further provisional measures were sought and granted, still ignored, and the case continues. It may not be resolved until 2027 or 2028. My prediction is that the court will indeed find Israel guilty of having committed the crime of genocide. I say that on the basis of the court's past record. First of all, I say it on the basis of what evidence was provided, some 5,000 pages of documentation provided by South Africa and other states which have joined the case with South Africa. I think, although in genocide cases the issue of intent is always the most difficult to prove, I don't think that there has been a case before the court in which the evidence of intent has been more abundant and clear. And then the court has actually an incredible record in its dealings on Israel-Palestine. Its 2024 advisory opinion on the status of the occupied territories was extremely principled and bold. So the ICJ, for all kinds of reasons, I think, has a kind of independence that enables it to really actually judge things in a reasonably fair way. And so I think they are going to, reach a finding eventually. Of course, it's not soon enough. How many more thousands of people will be dead by then is indeterminate. And of course, Israel has gone on to apply the same set of doctrines to southern Lebanon and Syria and the like. So there's going to be a lot of pain before the legal developments reach any kind of conclusion. That may not be a complete answer, but I realize I've already sort of taken a fair amount of time, and maybe I should give somebody else a chance. Thank you. Yeah.
Sydney has some questions.
Sydney?
George, I want to thank you for this lucid and very important presentation.
Thank you.
And make a comment.
Please.
Yesterday, I wore my Free VC shirt. That was Free Washington, D.C.
Yes.
From the likes of President Donald Trump.
Yeah.
The comment is, we're all in it together, and how do we get rid of Donald Trump? Because if we don't, we're in this position that it's not only indigenous people and others, but everybody is deeply in trouble the entire world.
Right. Well, yes. Thank you, Sydney. I just let me observe quickly that we in the United States we see promoted primarily by the Trump administration an attack against academic freedom and free speech, which kind of analogous to the attack on international law. It's an attack on domestic law, again using sort of Israel as a spearhead for the sake of Israeli interests, but also for the sake of the American right-wing vision of how our society ought to operate. And I'm talking about the assaults on higher education, the crackdowns, on student encampments that followed the Gaza genocide, in response to the Gaza genocide, et cetera. So we are in many ways already paying the price domestically. What we have to do, I think, is vote, support, people, support candidates who are, congressional candidates who are our allies in this struggle. And I'll just say baldly that I think come November, we may have to lay our bodies on the line and be out in public in huge numbers, because I think there's a definite, clear effort to steal the elections in November, and to make sure that that the Democratic Party, of which I'm no fan, but still see as a vehicle for for our collective struggle. I think we may really have to ourselves as a people, speaking obviously to the Americans in the audience, we may have to be out there in the streets to defend our rights and our democracy.
Thank you, George, I'm with you.
Thank you, Sidney. Appreciate it.
George,
Appreciate it.
you have two individuals, and one individual says they're in an altercation, and one says, I will beat you senseless, and then walks away. And then that individual sees the person that they have threatened on a corner, and he beats him senseless. Now that's intent. Am I correct or not?
So the victim of the first beating finds the perpetrator of that first beating?
No, the person threatens the second person. And then the person that makes the threat sees the person later that he's threatened, and then beats him senseless like he said he would do.
Yes.
So that's a cause of intent, correct?
Yes, I would think that's.
So
that demonstrates intent.
when you have a world leader stating that I will wipe you off the face of the earth,
Yeah,
is that not intent?
it is.
So
It expresses intent.
it expresses intent.
Here's the, yeah.
So what I've said.
You're referring to Trump's threats to
And
Iran, you mean?
So what I've said to students, that there has been intent. So if that is followed through with a bombing, then it's clearly someone following up on intent.
Yes. Now, statements that people make are, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the distinction between direct and circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence is something that directly proves a fact in question. In a case, circumstantial evidence is evidence that you have to draw an inference from in order to have a conclusion that's relevant in a case. Statements like, I'm going to wipe your civilization out, as Trump, paraphrasing him roughly, his threats to Iran. Threats like that are, in fact, they sound like direct evidence. In fact, they're circumstantial evidence, because Trump would come back and say, if he were in the dock, he were defending himself, I was bluffing, I didn't really mean it. I made this statement in order to try to intimidate it was a negotiating tactic. So there are those kinds of challenges in proving actual intent. However, maybe that explanation is not reasonable. People don't believe it, and you can certainly use it as evidence of genocidal intent. It's with Israel is. There are so many statements by so many public officials, from the Prime Minister to the Defense Minister to every other damn minister in the government, to the soldiers in the field in the Gaza Strip, who are so emboldened by the impunity that Israel is granted that they post to social media their chants about how they're going to wipe out Amalek, which was, in other words, echoing the kind of the reference that the prime minister had made and showing how the kind of the idea, the genocidal idea, moved down from the prime minister to the soldiers in the field. There's just as abundant evidence as you can find. Now, I mean, Israel will have its arguments, and the court will do, what it does in these cases. But I might, as I stated previously, I think that the finding will be that evidence that genocide has been committed.
So the part that I actually ended that whole kind of thing on was that when you have the threat and then an action actually follows the threat.
Yeah.
That's what I was pointing at.
Right. Yeah. Well, yes. Generally speaking, when if people act in accord with a statement, it's pretty strong circumstantial evidence that they had the intent to commit that act, and that the outcome that they have caused was what they actually intended.
Okay, good. We can move the next 15 minutes into more questions.
I
Yeah.